Hello, it's Kelly here, and I'm going to talk now for a short while about qualitative versus quantitative approaches to gathering evidence. Now, one of the decisions that researchers need to make when approaching any project is related to how they intend to gather their evidence, and an important consideration at this stage relates to whether or not this will entail a qualitative or a quantitative approach, or in some cases, a mixture between the two. So, this podcast talks through some of the factors that can help guide that decision and identifies when and why a particular approach to gathering evidence may be considered to be appropriate. The type of approach that you decide will be most appropriate is going to depend on a number of different things. So it will depend, for example, on the theoretical approach that you're taking to research. It will depend on your own worldview and the aims and objectives of the particular project that you're completing. It will also be dependent to some degree on your own interests and your own preferences. So we'll come on to talk about these in a little bit more detail within this podcast. What I do want to clarify at the beginning is that I'm not trying to tell you in any way that one approach is necessarily better than another. Some general advice that I want to pass on is to avoid some of the myths that you might occasionally hear about qualitative and quantitative methods. The first of these myths, as I'm referring to them here, is the tendency for people to think that qualitative research is somehow an easy option. So, because it doesn't involve the same level of complex statistical techniques, some people tend to think that conducting qualitative research is going to be easier or quicker. The first thing I would say in relation to that is that qualitative research is often actually more time consuming than quantitative research, and it can involve a lot of detailed and rigorous analysis of perhaps interview data or whatever type of data that you're collecting. The second is that I wouldn't want you to feel afraid or put off from conducting quantitative research because of the statistical component, because quite often, as you'll hopefully become aware as you develop on this course, the statistics aren't as complex or as difficult as you might think they will be. Another thing to avoid is the myth that qualitative research is somehow less scientific or perhaps isn't going to get published as easily as quantitative research. So it's important that we try to move beyond these myths and to focus on what are the important considerations and the important questions that we ought to be asking when determining the most appropriate approach to use for our research. So I've mentioned that there are some theoretical considerations here. So to give you an example of that, if we're approaching an area in which there is a lot of existing theory and our research is aiming to test that theory either by proving or disproving an existing hypothesis, that kind of theory testing is associated generally with the quantitative techniques, whereas if we're approaching an area that's relatively new and we're looking to build up a theory based on a more inductive process, then we might want to think about using a qualitative approach as being more appropriate here. So the question that we might want to ask ourselves at this stage is, are we looking to test an existing theory or are we looking to develop and build a new theory? And the answer to that question can put us in the right direction in terms of whether qualitative or quantitative approaches might be most appropriate. There are other considerations. So I mentioned that your own worldview is also likely to be relevant here. Now, I don't think it's appropriate to go into great depth about different worldviews, but some of the guiding principles would be whether or not, as a researcher, we believe that there is one single reality. So, can we go out there and test in an objective manner whether or not a particular hypothesis can be accepted or rejected? If this is the case, then we might be looking at using more quantitative approaches. Whereas we might want to take a more subjective approach and say there's not necessarily one real singular reality, but there are multiple realities. and it's up to us as researchers to investigate some of these different perspectives on certain issues and to think about this in a more illustrative way, in which case we might be moving more towards the qualitative approaches.